The rain fell in sheets over the Bavarian Alps, washing down the granite slopes like molten silver under the flash of distant lightning. The mountains, ancient and unmoving, seemed to hold their breath as thunder rolled from peak to peak. Somewhere beneath that eternal rock, men were carving madness into stone. They called it der Schattenturm, the shadow tower, though it was neither tower nor castle, but a fortress of concrete and steel buried so deep beneath the mountain that no bomb could ever reach it. It began as rumor, a whisper passed among officers who still dared to believe that Germany's defeat was temporary. Hitler's engineers, they said, were building him a sanctuary, a hidden citadel from which he would outlast the Allies and strike again when the world least expected it. To the exhausted citizens of the Reich, it was a comforting myth. To those who built it, it was a prison of their own making. Hidden under 300 feet of solid rock near Berchtesgaden, the bunker stretched downward like the roots of a dying tree. The upper levels held barracks, armories, and storage depots. Below that were command rooms lined with radio equipment, cipher machines, and reinforced map chambers. Deeper still lay Hitler's personal quarters, an underground replica of the Bärhof, complete with oak furniture, imported carpets, and portraits of Prussian kings. The air was recycled, the light artificial, the sound of rain replaced by the mechanical hum of turbines and ventilation fans. Albert Speer himself had overseen the project. His men had worked around the clock, pulling thousands of laborers from the concentration camps to carve out the tunnels. The walls were poured in layers of volcanic concrete mixed with pulverized quartz, capable, so the engineers boasted, of withstanding the blast of a direct hit from the Allies' heaviest ordnance. The internal pressure system was so finely tuned that even if the outer entrances were sealed by landslides or bombs, the people inside would not suffocate. But within this machine of stone and steel was one man whose heart still beat with conscience, Captain Elias Morgenstern. He was a quiet Austrian engineer, thin and bespectacled, who had survived the trenches of the Great War only to watch his country fall under the banner of another madness. He had joined the engineering corps not out of loyalty to the Führer, but because he had no choice. Resistance was death. When Speer's ministry ordered his transfer to the Bavarian Alps in late 1943, he went without question, signing papers that forbade him from speaking to anyone about his work. He knew even then that he was being sent to build something monstrous, and he swore silently that he would leave a scar in its perfection. Morgenstern was placed in charge of the bunker's air filtration systems, the lungs of der Schattenturm. It was his job to ensure that the Führer could breathe, no matter what happened above. He spent months designing ductwork that twisted through the mountain like veins, connecting dozens of intake shafts to the deep subterranean chambers. The system drew air through layers of filters, treated it with chemical scrubbers, and circulated it through pressure-regulated corridors. No smoke, no gas, no contamination could enter. It was flawless. Too flawless. And so, quietly, Morgenstern introduced a flaw. On a cold evening in February 1944, as snow buried the valley above, he stayed late after the other engineers had gone. He pored over the blueprints, his hands trembling slightly as he altered one line, one seemingly insignificant valve placement on the master diagram. It was a bypass conduit, barely the width of a human arm, that connected one of the primary air shafts to a natural crevice in the rock. To any inspector, it looked like a minor structural reinforcement. To him, it was the seed of rebellion. That bypass would become a silent artery to the outside world, a place where air from the mountain could mix, unseen, with the bunker's carefully purified atmosphere. He told no one. Not his colleagues, not his wife, not even the priest he sometimes visited under the pretense of confession. He knew what discovery would mean.
For months he labored as if nothing had changed, signing off on each section as it was sealed behind concrete. By early 1945, the system was complete. Der Schattenturm was ready, airtight, self-sufficient, and waiting for its master.
When Hitler finally arrived on April 2, 1945, the sky was black with storm clouds, and the valleys echoed with distant artillery. He came in a heavily guarded convoy, traveling by night from Berlin through shattered cities and smoking fields. Eva Braun sat beside him in silence, her hands clutching a leather case filled with family photographs and cyanide capsules. Behind them came a train of SS guards, aides, and secretaries, their faces pale and hollow. The descent into the bunker was like entering another world. The steel doors closed behind them with a hiss that echoed through the tunnels like the sound of a coffin lid shutting. Inside, the temperature was a steady 16 degrees. The walls were smooth and sterile, illuminated by rows of humming fluorescent lamps. The air was dry, metallic. Hitler paused only once during his tour of the command chambers. "It is perfect," he said, his voice a whisper of awe and exhaustion. "Here, they cannot touch me." Speer nodded, though his expression was strained. "The ventilation is the finest ever constructed, my Führer. It draws air from deep within the mountain, filtered through 5 layers of carbon and quartz. Even poison gas could not reach you here." Morgenstern stood among the engineers, his heart thudding in his chest. The Führer's eyes swept over him for a moment, cold, blue, and feverish, then moved on. That night, the bunker came alive. Telephones rang, radio operators tapped frantically at Morse keys, and officers hurried through the corridors with reports from fronts that no longer existed. Hitler held conferences twice daily, still issuing orders to phantom divisions. The air inside was heavy with despair and fanaticism, the scent of oil and sweat mingling into something suffocating. And yet, through all that machinery, through the recycled air and stale fear, Morgenstern sometimes caught a faint trace of something else, the scent of pine. It came in the quiet hours, when the ventilation fans shifted cycles. A whisper of the outside world, sneaking in through the flaw he had built. He began to believe that flaw was alive. To the others, it was nothing. To him, it was hope. Proof that no wall, no regime, no tyrant could seal itself away completely from the truth. Days turned into weeks. Above ground, Germany was dying. The Russians were closing in on Berlin from the east. The Americans had crossed the Rhine. But below the mountain, Hitler's voice echoed through the bunker's loudspeakers like the voice of a ghost commanding shadows. "We will not surrender," he raged. "The fatherland is eternal. The Allies will destroy themselves against these walls." Morgenstern knew better. He could feel the Flaw breathing with every shift in air pressure, a pulse running through the ducts like a heartbeat. He had created a living weakness in a fortress built for death, and somewhere deep inside, he prayed that one day someone would find it. Outside, in the world of rain and ruin, men like Colonel Robert Hawthorne were already listening. They had intercepted strange transmissions, encrypted signals pulsing from the Alps, faint but steady. They did not yet know what they meant, nor what secrets the mountain kept. But destiny was moving toward Der Schattenturm, step by step, through fog and storm, toward the Flaw that would change the war forever. The mountain waited, silent. The Flaw breathed. And the Reich's last fortress slept, unaware that its doom was already built into its bones. The war outside the Alps had turned into a storm of metal and fire. Berlin was collapsing under the weight of Soviet artillery. The western skies burned red as Allied bombers turned what was left of Germany into ash. Yet far to the south, in the quiet of the mountains, the illusion of control still lived, buried deep beneath rock and secrecy. Inside their Schattenturm, the air was clean, the corridors spotless, the walls humming with mechanical life. To the men stationed there, it was as if the apocalypse above had been placed on pause. They moved through the corridors in pressed uniforms, saluting portraits of Hitler as if the war still obeyed his will. But it was a fragile illusion, one that trembled with every distant tremor of the collapsing Reich. The Führer's health had deteriorated beyond recovery. His hands trembled violently. His voice cracked with exhaustion. But his belief in victory, or perhaps his delusion of it, had only grown stronger. He spoke to invisible armies, conjuring phantom divisions from maps scattered across his conference table. He shouted at his generals, accusing them of cowardice, treachery, and incompetence. And still they stood before him, faces pale and hollow, bowing to a ghost. The bunker itself became a shrine to a dying empire. The walls were lined with stolen art, gold leaf frames reflecting the flickering lights of the generators. A grand piano stood in the lounge, where Eva Braun sometimes played for him, her hands trembling over the keys as she tried to drown out the sound of distant gunfire playing on the surface above. And in the background, Captain Elias Morgenstern worked in silence. He inspected gauges, adjusted pressure valves, and monitored the readings of the filtration system he himself had built. Every dial, every hiss of air reminded him of the Flaw, his secret rebellion hidden within the fortress's iron lungs. No one knew of it. Not the SS guards who stalked the halls, not Speer's inspectors, not even the Führer himself. But the Flaw knew. Morgenstern often stood alone in the ventilation chamber, his face lit by the pale glow of instrument panels. He would close his eyes and breathe deeply. Amid the sterile scent of recycled air, he could always detect that faint whisper, the trace of the outside world, of pine and stone and freedom. It was the mountain breathing back at him, through the bypass valve he had left open, small enough to escape notice, but wide enough to carry the faint echo of life. He sometimes imagined the mountain itself was alive, that the earth was waiting to reclaim what man had buried within it. Above ground, the Allied advance swept closer every day. On April 15th, the Americans crossed the Danube. A week later, reconnaissance planes flew over the Bavarian Alps, searching for signs of a rumored fortress, Hitler's supposed last redoubt. The intelligence reports called it the Alpenfestung, the Alpine Fortress, though no one in London or Washington believed such a thing truly existed. It sounded like another of the Führer's fantasies. But one man believed it was real. Colonel Robert Hawthorne, of the British Special Operations Executive, had been watching the pattern for months. Intercepted radio bursts, encrypted transmissions that came not from Berlin or Munich, but from deep in the Alps. His analysts dismissed them as misdirection, but Hawthorne's instinct told him otherwise. Sitting in the dim light of his London war room, he listened to the rhythmic tapping of Morse code echoing through the headphones. Numbers repeated in 6-hour intervals, always the same sequence. He scribbled them down and traced the coordinates on a map. The lines converged near Berchtesgaden, Hitler's mountain retreat. "Something's alive down there," he murmured, "and it's not just static." His commanding officer raised an eyebrow. "You're suggesting the Führer's hiding in a mountain?" Hawthorne met his gaze. "If I were him, that's exactly where I'd be." Within days, he was given authorization for a black operation, unacknowledged, deniable. A 6-man team, dropped behind enemy lines, with orders to find the source of the transmissions and, if possible, silence them. They left in silence, flying across occupied Europe in a C-47 under cover of darkness.
The plane's interior reeked of oil and sweat, the only sound the steady hum of the engines. The men sat in grim quiet, veterans of North Africa and Normandy, faces weathered and hard. There was Rowe, the explosives expert, Connors, the radio operator, Lieutenant Briggs, the medic, and two riflemen known only by their call signs, Ghost and Hawk. Before the jump, Hawthorne stood and addressed them. "What we're walking into might not exist, but if it does, it's the last beating heart of the Reich. If we can stop it, maybe this war ends a few days sooner, maybe a few thousand fewer die." No one replied. They simply nodded, adjusted their parachutes, and prepared to leap into the void. At 0200 hours, the plane's door opened to a sky filled with storm clouds. Wind howled through the cabin. Lightning illuminated the mountains below, white flashes revealing endless black ridges and forests drowning in fog.
"Go!" Hawthorne shouted.
They jumped. For a few terrifying seconds, there was only the roar of wind, the sensation of falling through eternity. Then the parachutes snapped open. The darkness swallowed them whole. They landed hard in a forest clearing somewhere north of Berchtesgaden, their boots sinking into wet earth. The air smelled of pine and rain. In the distance, thunder rolled, or perhaps artillery. They moved silently through the forest, avoiding roads, skirting villages where the last desperate remnants of the Wehrmacht still patrolled. For days they climbed through valleys and cliffs, guided by compass and rumor. Twice they narrowly escaped detection, once by a passing SS convoy, once by a patrol searching for deserters. By the third night, exhausted and starving, they reached a narrow ridge overlooking a dark valley. Through the mist, they saw faint plumes of smoke rising from the mountain itself, small, rhythmic puffs that seemed too precise to be natural. Rowe peered through his binoculars. "Looks like exhaust vents," he whispered. "Too uniform to be random." Hawthorne took the binoculars and adjusted the focus. Metal glinted in the moonlight, faint lines of reinforced structure embedded into the rock. "That's no vent," he said softly. "That's a bunker." They descended carefully, using ropes to lower themselves down the cliff face. The closer they came, the more unnatural the mountain looked. Smooth seams of steel hidden beneath layers of moss and stone, conduits that disappeared into darkness. Then Rowe found it, a small grate half buried behind a cluster of rocks. He brushed away the moss, revealing the dull gleam of welded steel. He pressed his ear against it. "Airflow," he whispered. "Strong and steady." Hawthorne ran his gloved fingers along the metal. The edges were too precise, too engineered. "A ventilation outlet," he muttered. "If this thing runs deep, it'll lead straight into the heart of the complex." Connors frowned. "You want to crawl into a Nazi mountain through a vent? That's suicide." Hawthorne looked up at the looming wall of rock, listening to the faint hum coming from within. "Suicide," he said quietly, "is letting them finish whatever they started down there." The decision was made. That night, under the veil of rain and thunder, the 6 men cut through the steel grate with a thermal torch. The sound was swallowed by the storm. One by one, they slipped inside, vanishing into the narrow shaft that led downward into the bowels of Der Schattenturm. Behind them, the wind howled through the Alps, carrying the faint whisper of the Flaw, that hidden crack in the fortress's perfect design. It was through that flaw that the mountain breathed, and through that same flaw, death itself was about to enter. The mountain had been waiting for this moment. The flaw had been waiting. And as Hawthorne's team descended into the dark, they unknowingly stepped into the same vein of fate that Captain Morgenstern had opened more than a year before.
A flaw so small, so human, that it would unravel the greatest evil the world had ever known. The whisper through the mountains was growing louder. It was no longer just the wind. It was history itself, moving toward its reckoning. The air inside the wolf's lair grew heavier by the day. The winter of 1944 pressed its cold fingers through the walls. But what chilled the men within wasn't the frost, it was doubt. Orders still came from the top, but whispers had begun to move through the ranks like ghosts. The Allies are closer. The Russians have crossed the Vistula. The Führer no longer sleeps. None dared speak too loud, for the walls in the bunker were said to hear. Major Wilhelm Kruger, a man whose eyes seemed always fixed on a distant storm, had been watching the tremors beneath the surface for months. Once a staunch believer, he had seen enough to recognize cracks in the legend. The wolf's lair was no fortress of destiny. It was a labyrinth of paranoia. He saw engineers working in silence, officers second-guessing every move, and couriers vanishing after a single conversation with Bormann. The Führer's inner circle had grown smaller, darker, obsessed with loyalty over truth. In a dim communications room, Kruger stood before a wall of blinking transmitters, their lights dancing like nervous fireflies. He had been reassigned to oversee signal security. The irony wasn't lost on him. His true duty, as ordered by his superior in Berlin, was to ensure that no unauthorized transmissions left the bunker. But there was a problem, a subtle, almost invisible one. The bunker's design, so proud and secret, had one flaw. It lay in the very heart of its shielding, the thick steel and concrete meant to block Allied reconnaissance and prevent interception. The layers were perfect for soundproofing, but the communications engineers had to carve narrow electromagnetic conduits through the shielding for long-range radio transmission. The conduits were thought to be impervious to interference, but they weren't. A certain frequency, buried deep in static, could slip through unnoticed. It was a whisper through stone. Kruger had discovered it by accident while testing frequency stability one evening. A pulse came through, faint, rhythmic, deliberate. At first, he assumed it was atmospheric interference. But then it repeated, the same pattern, 5 short, 3 long, 5 short. Morse code, not random, not atmospheric. A signal from outside, or from within. He leaned closer, his heart pounding like the engine of a dive bomber. The code repeated again, slower this time, breach in faith. Inside the den. Then silence. He switched off the receiver and sat back, the sweat cold on his neck. Someone inside the wolf's lair was sending messages out through the bunker's flaw. Someone who knew exactly how to hide them. For 3 nights he traced the anomaly. Each time, the signal appeared between 01:00 and 01:05, a 5-minute window of perfect stillness. The operator masked it within authorized transmissions. Whoever it was, they had mastery of both engineering and deception. Kruger narrowed his suspects, the radio technicians, perhaps an intelligence officer, or one of the cryptographers stationed under the central corridor. But why risk it? What could be so important that a man would send coded words through Hitler's most secret fortress? On the 4th night, Kruger decided to act. He stationed himself behind the bulkhead near the communications relay. As the clock struck 1, the faint hum began again. A shadow moved across the opposite wall, tall, lean, precise. Kruger's hand went to his Luger, but he waited. The figure adjusted a dial, pressed a switch, and leaned into the microphone. Kruger steppt vorwärts, gun raised. Nicht bewegen. The man froze. Slowly, he turned. It was Lieutenant Erich Müller, one of the cryptographers, quiet, efficient, known for his calm demeanor. Müller didn't flinch. Instead, he looked Kruger dead in the eyes and said, You've seen it too, haven't you?
Kruger hesitated. Seen what?
The flaw, the heartbeat beneath the bunker. You think this fortress protects him, but it imprisons us all. Muller's tone was soft, almost resigned. Do you know what we are building, Major? It's not victory. It's a tomb.
Kruger gestured with his pistol. You're sending messages to the enemy.
To the truth, Muller replied simply. Berlin's fallen in all but name. The Americans know more than they admit. The Russians are 2 weeks from the Oder. You think this place matters? The Führer hides here, talking to ghosts, giving orders to shadows. The war is lost, but the blood keeps flowing. Kruger's hand trembled. He had heard similar thoughts whispered in confidence, then buried forever in reports labeled treason. Why the messages? He demanded. Mella looked toward the humming radio. Because they need to know the flaw exists. The Allies, the resistance. Someone has to know that this place isn't as impenetrable as he believes. If they exploit it, they could end it sooner. Fewer cities burned, fewer dead.
You'll be shot for this, Kruger said.
Then shoot me, Muller replied quietly. But if you don't, listen to the noise beneath the static. You'll hear the world trying to breathe again. Kruger didn't shoot, not that night. He ordered Muller confined to quarters, filed no report, and returned to his post, his thoughts a battlefield of their own. That evening, as he watched the map room through the slit of the observation door, he saw Hitler himself pacing before a massive table strewn with arrows and markers that no longer matched reality. The Führer's face was waxen, his left hand trembling, his eyes flicking toward unseen enemies. He spoke of wonder weapons, of turning tides, of final vengeance. But the men around him, Keitel, Jodl, Bormann, only nodded, their silence the silence of fear. The bunker's flaw wasn't just structural, Kruger realized. It was psychological. It wasn't the steel that would fail, it was faith. And faith was crumbling faster than concrete under bombardment. By mid-January, the coded messages had multiplied. More operators were using the flaw, passing fragments of information that found their way to Allied intercept stations in Poland and Sweden. Each signal, though small, chipped at the illusion of security. The flaw had become a conduit of betrayal, of hope, depending on who you asked. Then came the night of the bombing. British mosquitoes streaked through the sky over East Prussia, guided by intelligence that should have been impossible for them to obtain. Their bombs fell with surgical precision. One struck the communications wing, not the main bunker, but close enough to rattle its core. As the alarms howled and concrete dust filled the corridors, Kruger saw it clearly for the first time. The flaw had changed the war. The Wolf's Lair, once the symbol of Hitler's untouchable will, was bleeding from within. And deep below, beneath layers of earth and lies, the signal pulsed again, faint, persistent, unstoppable. He didn't know yet that this whisper would ignite a chain of events leading to the collapse of the Reich itself. But as he stood in the choking haze of smoke and fear, Kruger understood that the war's end would not come from tanks or guns. It would come from the smallest fracture, a flaw hidden in the heart of madness. By February 1945, the Wolf's Lair was no longer a fortress. It was a coffin dressed in camouflage. The snow outside melted into rivers of mud that swallowed trucks whole, and the constant drone of distant artillery had become a new kind of heartbeat beneath the ground. The forests around Rastenburg were no longer silent. Soviet scouts had been spotted less than 50 kilometers away. The invisible front was moving, tightening its grip like a hand around the throat of a dying beast. Inside, the walls dripped with condensation. The smell of oil, damp concrete, and desperation filled every corridor. Hitler no longer left his private chambers except to meet with the generals, and even those meetings were growing shorter, more violent, more detached from reality. He spoke of armies that no longer existed, divisions that had been wiped out months before. The maps that once dictated the fate of continents now looked like mockeries, red lines of encirclement closing in from all directions. Major Wilhelm Kruger moved like a ghost through this decaying sanctum. He saw things others pretended not to see: the guards who avoided eye contact, the officers burning documents in silence, the engineers dismantling radio parts with trembling hands. The flaw in the bunker, the small electromagnetic gap that allowed signals to slip through, had become the artery of a dying empire. Messages leaked through it like whispers through cracks in a tomb. The Allies knew things they shouldn't have known: convoy movements, relocation plans, evacuation routes. The once proud secrecy of the Wolf's Lair had become its greatest vulnerability. Kruger had stopped trying to trace every transmission. The flaw had become too widespread, too woven into the structure of the communications web. Every operator who knew of it had their own agenda. Some sent out pleas for surrender. Others funneled information to resistance networks. And a few used it for personal gain, trading secrets for safe passage if the walls finally fell. The bunker had turned into a hive of quiet betrayals. Then, one morning, a convoy arrived, unannounced, unexpected. It bore the insignia of the SS, and from its lead car stepped Heinrich Himmler himself. His black uniform gleamed even in the dull light of the bunker entrance, his face carved from ice. He brought with him his own staff, his own guards, his own silence. By nightfall, half the bunker's existing personnel had been relieved of duty. Rumors spread that the Führer's paranoia had reached a fever pitch. There were traitors among them, he believed, saboteurs working for the Allies, plotting to assassinate him, to end the Third Reich from within. What no one yet realized was that his suspicion was right, but the betrayal had already happened, not through bullets or bombs, but through the invisible flaw pulsing with every secret broadcast. Kruger was summoned to Himmler's new command post deep inside the secondary corridor. The room smelled of fear and stale tobacco. "Major Kruger," Himmler began, his voice a flat whisper, "you have been in charge of communications security here. I want to know how the British found us during last month's bombing raid." Kruger hesitated. "There were reports of interference in the transmission lines, Reichsführer. A technical anomaly, perhaps. Nothing confirmed." Himmler's eyes narrowed. "An anomaly? You think the enemy navigates through anomalies? Someone here betrayed us, Major. Someone used our own systems to expose our location. And if you cannot find them, I will find you." The threat hung in the air like the stench of cordite. Kruger saluted, left the room, and for the first time in his military life considered desertion. But there was nowhere to go. The forest was crawling with patrols. The east was aflame. Only the west offered hope. But hope was a luxury buried under a mountain of concrete. That night, as the lamps flickered in the communication wing, Kruger found a folded note on his desk. No seal, no name. Only 3 words, written in precise, trembling script. "They know everything." He turned it over, blank. But when he held it closer to the lamplight, faint impressions appeared on the paper's fibers, pressure marks from previous writing. He tilted it further and could just make out the words: "Muller executed. Signals compromised. Run." The name hit him like a shell burst. Lieutenant Muller, the man who had first uncovered the flaw, the man who had tried to use it to end the war sooner. Kruger felt his throat tighten.
So the SS had found him. And if they had found Muller, they were now closing in on him too. He locked the door, turned off the lights, and powered up the receiver. The faint hum of the radio filled the darkness, like the last breath of a dying machine. He tuned the dial carefully, searching through the static, through the ocean of noise. For an hour there was nothing. Then, a faint signal. 5 short, 3 long, 5 short. The same pattern as before. The same ghostly pulse. But this time the message continued. Signal breach confirmed. Evacuation imminent. Den collapsing. Iron walls breaking. He recorded it, his heart hammering. The Allies were aware. They had mapped the Flaw, triangulated its source. They were coming not just for Berlin, but for the Wolf's Lair itself. The following day, chaos erupted. Orders came to evacuate all critical personnel to new headquarters in the south. The Führer refused to leave at first, raging against invisible enemies, but eventually agreed after a heated confrontation with his generals. The evacuation began under heavy snow. Trucks rolled through the forest like ghosts in the mist, headlights dimmed, engines coughing. Soldiers set demolition charges throughout the bunker complex. Hitler's final command: if the Wolf's Lair cannot be held, it must not exist. Kruger moved among the men, giving silent instructions, his face hidden beneath his cap. He had decided he would not flee south with the others. He would stay behind to make sure the Flaw's machinery, the transmitters, the records were destroyed before the SS could use them again. He no longer fought for Hitler. He fought to erase the poison the man had created. As the last convoys departed, the air filled with the low thunder of distant artillery. The Russians were coming. Kruger descended into the radio chamber one final time. The walls trembled around him, dust falling like snow. He looked at the console, the tangled wires, the blinking lights, the signal that had undone the myth of invincibility. He whispered to himself, "This was never a fortress, only a mirror." Then he pressed the detonator. The explosion ripped through the forest, tearing concrete and steel apart, swallowing the Wolf's Lair in smoke and fire. Flames licked the sky, consuming Hitler's myth along with the men who had built it. But deep beneath the rubble, the faint echo of that signal still lingered in the ether, racing across the static, the Flaw that had changed the war.